Well, it is great to be here with y'all this morning. This is such a joyful Sunday, and just the music coming in, and just so many layers of excitement today. For me, this is a very special Sunday for two reasons. First of all, because it was 20 years ago, Easter Sunday 2004, that I first became a member of this church. So, very cool anniversary. And when I thought about that what happened then, it really was one of the most important transitions of my adult life, when things reoriented themselves. I was a very miserable law student at the time. I was also an interim Church of Christ preacher, if you can believe that, and was very, very unhappy. It was in the early days of the Iraq War, and I really felt like I was supposed to be preaching about this, and yet I knew if I did, I'd lose my job. And so in the midst of all that, I went to a peace protest at the Gold Dome Corner, met Sadie Mast, and that changed me. Of course, she told me, grow where you're planted. I told her I was thinking about leaving the Church of Christ. She said, no, you should stay where you are. But they fired me, so then it's like, oh, Sadie, I tried.
But not too hard.
Yeah. So it was like November of 2003 was when that happened, and got involved right after that, and then became a member on Easter of 2004. So, and thinking about this relation to church, any 20-year relationship is going to be messy and bumpy. Any marriage, 20 years, I'm in 12 years into marriage, and it's been wonderful, and it's been bumpy, and it's been real. And that's what a marriage is supposed to be. The same thing with any other relationship. So thinking about my time of joy, it's been bumpy, it's been messy. But I will take real and authentic, messy bumpiness any day over clean, phony superficialness. So that's one of the things I'm celebrating today. Secondly, though, this is Easter Sunday, this day that celebrates the story of the resurrection of Jesus and the birth of what would become Christianity. But for us at Joy, it is more complicated to celebrate Easter because we are a theologically diverse community. Within this community, not just the people in this room, but other people who are part of this community, we have people who believe in the literal story of the resurrection, that Jesus literally, bodily rose from the dead. We have other people in this community, and I'm in this camp, who would say, no, I don't believe it literally happened, but I see value in the metaphor. I can connect with the metaphor even if I don't believe it to be literally true. And then beyond these two polarities, I suspect there's other people who are something else or just aren't sure. And so how do we as a community here today engage with Easter, celebrate this time when we don't all agree about what happened? We don't all agree, at least, about the factual details of the event. Well, at first glance, I think there's many people who say, this is impossible. How could a church possibly celebrate Easter together, celebrate these stories, celebrate Jesus, and have different points of view? Well, I want to argue today there's two reasons I think we can do this. 2 points of commonality. First of all, we as a community share an Anabaptist Mennonite understanding that prioritizes the life and teachings of Jesus. We see value in Jesus' ethical, earthly teachings on nonviolence, equality, authentic living, and solidarity with the poor. These are uniting principles for Mennonites, and they transcend our views about the supernatural. Secondly, though, we find common ground, I believe, in looking beyond the question of fact, beyond the question of what literally happened, instead asking, why is the story so powerful? And does it somehow tap into one of the big questions of the human experience? Is death the end of the story? Well, in our time together today, we're going to be exploring those two pieces of common ground in more detail. But we're going to be doing so by telling a story, by exploring a story of an important event in the history of Joy Mennonite Church, a time when this community stepped up to live out the radical love and solidarity that Jesus advocated. This is also a story that deals pretty directly with the metaphor of resurrection. So, for this story, we are going back in time to 1993. And I know some of you remember 1993. I do. I was a senior in high school in the fall of 1993. So, before we delve into 1993, as much fun as that is, we first need to talk a little bit about what brought the church to the point it was at in 1993. And so for that, we have to go back a little further in time. We're just for a few minutes, a quick recap of the story of the Mennonites, history of the Mennonites in Oklahoma City up to this point. So first of all, this picture, by the way, is from 1973 Oklahoma City Times. Headline reads, "All for one, one for all. Group living's no experiment. Young people live cheaply but happily." And this was all these pictures and everything. It was right here in this building. So the Mennonite presence here began with the MVS, Mennonite Voluntary Service House, in the mid-60s, right here in this house. The MVS unit provided a way for conscientious objectors to complete their alternative service, but it also provided opportunities for young adults of all kinds to do a gap year or two of voluntary service and intentional living in an urban context, which, let's be frank, was a very edgy thing for the rural Mennonite tradition. And again, this is picked this news clipping, and I actually think Stanley Smucker showed this. And that's how I got the picture. I just have a picture of this half of the page, but I think it was when Stanley Smucker came down for the reunion we did the Trinity folks. I'm pretty sure that's where I got this from, if you're wondering. Along with that, though, at the same time that the MVS house was doing all the work it was doing, and again, I'd love to tell more about all of these things today. So we're just skirting back past them quickly because we're giving context. When we get to the next bit of the story, another piece of this that brought us to 1993 was the story of Trinity United Church. What was involved here was that during this time, the MVS house played a role in a very innovative experiment, creating a united church that brought together people, white people and black people in very segregated Oklahoma City of the time. It was also bi-denominational, Mennonite and Presbyterian. I'm pretty sure it was the first time that had ever been done. And this was done in cooperation with Trinity Presbyterian Church, which was already a very cutting-edge church doing some really interesting things before the merger. Now, this particular project lasted for about a decade before Trinity continued on as Trinity Presbyterian, and the MVS house continued in its work for another decade. But these two things I have on the screen here, one, it says, in the Oklahoma City Times, 1970, "City churches plan unusual marriage." And there's a picture that says, "The Reverend Stanley Smucker left and Reverend James DeFriend discussed plan of union before Trinity Presbyterian Church." And so there's them. And then this is a picture from the directory of the Trinity United Church. And again, it says Mennonite Presbyterian. By the way, I was very tempted. I have a picture of Ralph that's very delightful from this time period. I debated about it, but I thought, no, I'll save that for another time. But towards the end, this work continued for about a decade. And towards the end of the time of the MVS house, the Western District Conference, which is the regional conference that we are a part of, sought to plant a new church on the south side of Oklahoma City, which would become Joy Mennonite Church. But one bit of interesting trivia. For a brief while, it was also known as Joy Community Church, which is interesting. That name did not stick. It went back to Joy Mennonite Church, but one little bit of trivia. Anyway, though this project started in the late 1980s, but after a few years, the conference believed the church wasn't viable and planned to close it. But members of the congregation here said no, they weren't ready to give up. And so as a result of that, the Western District Conference ended up doing two things that set us up for some good things in the future. First of all, they connected Joy with Moses and Sadie Mast, who became the new pastoral team, starting on a part-time interim basis as they were fulfilling other obligations in Central America and at Heston College. But eventually, with Moses preaching every Sunday starting in the summer of 1992. Now, by the way, note the date there. When he was here, before they were like once a month, once every couple of months. But after that, summer 1992 is when he was here all the time. So that's an important date to keep in mind. So anyway, Moses and Sadie brought many things to this church. Their hearts dedicated to serving their fellow human beings, a commitment to simplicity and solidarity with the poor, and most of all, a focus on Jesus' message of peace. And I can't forget to mention the role that Moses and Sadie had over the years in mentoring so many peace and social justice activists. We also to mention their work in interfaith relations and their work against racism. Their energy and concern impacted us all and set up this congregation to be what it is today. So that was one thing that the WDC did, was making that connection with us and them. Secondly, though, a few years later, a little bit late. The congregation was in the late 80s. Moses came in 91 or so, started being more full-time summer of 92. By the fall, September of 92, Joy, in fact, I'm just going to read this. This is from the Joy newsletter from 1993. This was from September 92. It says, in a turn of events, closing the VS unit at 504 Northeast 16th Street, this house here in Oklahoma City, the trustees of the Western District Conference, owners of the above property, wishing not to have the building stand vacant and not be used, are letting us use the building there as our church home. We are moving even as you read this, and we will be open for worship at the same 10 a.m. hour each Sunday. Hope to see you there. That is at the southwest corner at the intersection of Northeast 16th and Lincoln Boulevard. So Joy is a church. Before that, we were meeting in borrowed rented space on the south side. But at this point, Joy started meeting here and has ever since. And so a lot of things are starting to happen to make Joy the congregation it was to become. And so as 1993 began, Joy Mennonite was really moving into its church childhood. Now, of course, it had these deep roots going back to the MVS house and the Trinity Project. But it was still a baby church, really only existing for just a few years at this point, only being in its current home for a few months, only having Moses here all the time just for a few months. So we're really talking about a very young church, but one that still has some deep roots. But which one noticed when reading the church newsletter, one thing that's really clear in those archives is that Joy was starting to become much more active. We were doing things. There were small groups meeting, and there's a lot more engagement on the issues that people were concerned about, social justice-wise. And we started seeing Joy have this confidence to speak with a prophetic voice. One of the things I was really struck by was Moses, in 1992, wrote an editorial in the newsletter talking about Columbus Day. Because it was the 500th anniversary of Columbus Day. And at that point in time, very few people in the broader society were questioning Columbus Day. Today, a lot more people are, thank goodness. They weren't then. But Moses was. Boy, he wrote a scathing editorial talking about why we need to reconsider celebrating Columbus Day. That was the kind of thing Moses was doing in 1992. And him and Sadie and the energy they brought was making this church a different place. Which takes us to our story for today. This picture here is of a man named Michael Leslie King. He lived from 1956 to 1993. And this is the latest picture I could find of him. Unfortunately, I could not find anything newer, but this was his senior year picture, 1975 in Okmulgee High School. Michael King was 36 years old, and he was part of Joy Mennonite for a few months before his tragic death from AIDS on August 7th, 1993. By the way, one mystery in preparing for this I was able to resolve was how Michael connected with Joy. It turns out he called the Western District Conference office in Newton, and then they put him in touch with Moses and Sadie, and then Moses and Sadie connected with him. And so I always wondered how he found this, but that was how. As far as we know, he didn't have any Mennonite background, so I'm not sure what prompted him to make this inquiry, but for whatever reason, he did. And by the way, before I should mention a little bit of Michael's background before he came to Joy. He grew up in Holdenville and later Okmulgee. His mom died when he was 10 years old. We don't know the circumstances of her death, but no matter what, we know it would have been a terribly disruptive thing. And so because of that, I think he spent the next 5 years or so living with his grandparents. Thanks to the school yearbooks I went through, I learned that he was in the band when he was in Holdenville, and I also know that he was in Okmulgee for the last couple of years of high school where he graduated. After that, we know that he worked some, and then about a year later he joined the Navy, where he served for 4 years. We know very little about him after that, other than I do know from some of the remembrances I've seen of him that he had some workplace challenges, and I have to believe that homophobia was probably a factor. So anyway, when the folks at Joy got to know him, it was really just the last few months of his life. And it was very quickly apparent that Michael was in poor health. So Moses and Sadie, but others as well. I know Cheryl, I'll tell more about Cheryl in a little bit. Ralph, do you remember other people that engaged in taking care of Michael or visiting him?
It was mostly Cheryl and Moses, mostly those three.
Most of those three.
Is that the one that lived kind of across the street? There was one that lived kind of across the street that the church could take care of. I never was there, but I heard them talking about it.
Yeah, this would be a long time before.
Okay.
Yeah. So anyway, they started checking up on him. But throughout all of this, Michael did not tell folks he had AIDS and did not tell folks that he was gay. And we have to remember, this was a very different time. But despite the fact of him not telling people, he did drop some hints. And so I reached out to Cheryl Critchley and asked her if she would share a little bit of her remembrances of Michael. And she wrote some really good stuff. This is what she said. Memories of Michael by Cheryl Critchley. Michael's memory remains, but many of the details of our brief encounters have faded into the shadows of time. I remember that Michael attended Joy Mennonite, but I am not sure how many times. I do remember that he took communion with us on one occasion. Mostly, what I knew about him at first was that he was ill and frail, and that Moses and Sadie were helping to care for him. I suspected that he had AIDS and was gay, but he only admitted that to Moses and Sadie in the hospital just before he died. Somehow, I discovered that I knew of his father. He worked at what was likely then the Safeway grocery store in Old Mulgee for many years. And by the way, I confirmed this from his obituary, that yes, he worked at the Safeway in Old Mulgee for many years. So Carol's right on that. Anyway, where Cheryl grew up. I remember him being a man of small build with glasses and dark, well-groomed hair. It seems I always saw him in a white coat. Perhaps he was a butcher. And he was often stocking the shelves of the meat counters. My parents likely knew his name, but I only learned it when the connection was made to Michael, and I've since forgotten it. I also learned, likely from Sadie, that he had not visited Michael since he learned of his diagnosis. Apparently he was afraid he would contract the disease by simply visiting his son. It still seems so sad to me, and I expect it was difficult for Michael. I knew nothing else about Michael's family. The one event that affected me the most was an evening when Moses and Sadie were going to be out of town, and they asked if I would go by and check on Michael after work, which I did. I cannot remember if I was supposed to wait for him to call if he needed me, or if I just went by. He was in bad shape by then, lying on a blanket in what I remember was a back porch. He was very frail, and apparently too weak to get up. I immediately wanted to call an ambulance for him, but he protested loudly. He eventually said that if I called them, he would refuse to go with them, so what would be the point? I believe I helped him onto the sofa. He lived in a small framed house that sat back from the street a bit. He had a vintage Volkswagen Beetle sitting in front of the house. He was becoming a bit confused and disoriented. I brought him something to drink, but his main request was that he get into a bath to clean up. I had worked as a nurse's aide in the past, so offered to help with this. But something about his bathtub didn't suit him. His thoughts were sort of all over the place. His idea was to have me get him to a room at the Havana Inn, where they had jetted room tubs in some rooms. By the way, just for anyone who did not grow up in Oklahoma, the Oklahoma City area, the Havana Inn in the 90s, and even today is well known as a hotel where gay people frequent. And even in Backwater in Newcastle, we heard about this. And again, a lot of homophobia and how he's perceived in Newcastle, obviously. But anyway, this is what he said. I offered to call them, and then he said no. I made a sort of joke that he just wanted to go there to find a date, and we both laughed. He knew that I knew that he was gay, but he did not have to come right out and tell me. We talked for a while, with me still trying to convince him that he needed to go to the hospital, or at least let me call someone who could stay with him. He apparently had no one. By the time I left, he was stronger and could go to the restroom by himself. He said that he wanted to sell his car, but people were trying to steal it. I stayed there for several hours until he drifted off to sleep, and then left him, but my heart was heavy. I called Sadie at some point and explained to her how it went. I remember telling her that I tried to be a good Mennonite, but I was not sure I had been. He went to the hospital a short time after that for the last time. I heard updates on Moses and Sadie. I'm not sure whether his father came to visit him before he died. Those were strange times, but Moses and Sadie never faltered in being the hands and heart of Christ, in my opinion. Another detail about Michael is that he really wanted very badly to extend love to this church, to reciprocate the love that he was being shown. But due to the health he was in, he was very limited in what he could do. One very touching thing I remember, though, was folks telling me about was about that he had found some collectible painted plates with biblical scenes on them. And I have pictures. These are the ones I remember. And unfortunately, I think these plates have been lost somewhere along the way. But there's a whole set of them, and it's by a guy named, I found them online, by a guy named Yanis Koutsis. It's called The Courageous Few. And the scenes are, the one on the left is the walls of Jericho. The one in the center is a story of David and Goliath. And then the one on the right is Ruth in the harvest fields. And again, they're just little plates, but to me, what I found kind of moving about them was just, it represented his love and represented what he was wanting to extend back to the congregation. He died on August 7th, 1993, and my understanding is that Moses and Sadie were the ones with him when he died. His passing hit the congregation hard. Here's one short tribute I found to him from the church newsletter in the month after he passed. As Joy Mennonite Church bids farewell to Michael King, we do so with many mixed feelings. It was painful to only be able to watch this young man of 36 years, slowly at first, then rapidly, waste away, and finally expiring on Saturday, 7 August 1993. Such a tragedy, a victim of AIDS. His suffering and torment are over now, and he is at peace. And God be praised for that. Rest your soul, Mike. To the end, Mike expressed his love and appreciation for us here at Joy Mennonite, and for his brief association with us. We hope these memories can be shared with Mike's family, together with our condolences to them in Christian love, to ease their pain and brighten their remembrance of Mike. Joy Mennonite Church.
Did Cheryl write this? Did you write it?
I don't know who wrote it. I'm thinking it may have been Bill Clausen, because it was another longer obituary kind of piece that I meant to print and have share, but I'll bring it another time. He wrote that as well. So I think maybe he wrote this.
I wouldn't doubt it at all.
It's really, really moving how he wrote. I'm pretty sure it's him. He also wrote about half of the stuff in the news. It was either him or Moses wrote most of the newsletter in those days. So going back to the metaphor now of the resurrection, like this, I think there's metaphor here too. There's in the midst of this, and like all resurrection stories, this one appears to be over. Mike is dead, a victim of a terrible plague that was decimating the LGBTQ community and hurting so many others. Also a victim of cruel, terrible timing. Just a few years later, came on the market the modern AIDS drug cocktail that turned being infected with HIV from a death sentence into a chronic manageable disease. But it was too late for him. The world of 2024 is very different than it was in 1993. Now I remember 1993 well. I was a senior in high school, and I was sadly a terrible homophobe. I remember the things that I and my friends said about people with AIDS and gay people in particular. And I wasn't alone. It was something pretty common and ubiquitous. There was a lot of fear and a lot of hate in those days. But Joy Mennonite, this church did something that I wasn't ready to do in 1993, that most people in Oklahoma weren't ready to do in 1993. They loved a gay man who was dying of AIDS. They didn't tell him he was evil or a sinner, but only that they loved him, that God loved him, and they were going to be there with him. And Mike loved this church back. And that love started the process of our resurrection, which would be a gradual process. Sometimes resurrections happen fast, sometimes they're gradual. In this case, it was gradual. Our relationship with Mike changed everything. Because a few years later, the issue of homosexuality in the Mennonite church came up as a hot-button issue in the broader denomination and the broader conference. And a very ugly resolution was put on the table at the WDC meeting to call for the church to be even more exclusionary than it had previously been, to close the door even tighter against queer people. But the people there from Joy Mennonite Church spoke up. They shared about their experiences with Mike and urged the WDC to not make life harder for gay people. their willingness to speak up made it easier for others to speak up. And if I remember right, that resolution was tabled after that. And Ralph, do you remember any of the details about that? I know it was pretty early on. It was before I was here, I know that. So it would have been somewhere in the 90s when that first time it came up.
Did you know him, Ralph? Did you?
Yeah, I went to his house quite often to stay with him. Just I worked so many hours and I didn't have the time to spend like Cheryl and Moses and Sadie did.
Mm-hmm.
I know we had just the Oklahoma churches had a meeting about this very issue of homosexuality, and they were trying to close the door. So the four of us went, Moses, Sadie, Cheryl, and I. Mm-hmm. And I told Moses on the way, there were 50 delegates altogether. I said, Moses, I'm worried vote's going to go 46 to 4. Mm-hmm. That it's going to be 4 people that are more open-minded about discussing it, homosexuality, and that's exactly how the vote turned out, as it was. Mm. The 4 of us voted to open discussion and work toward more relationship. And boy, in those days, the Oklahoma rural churches were just didn't want no part of it.
Yeah. But Joy kept speaking up, and just like what Ralph shared at the Oklahoma Convention meetings, WDC meetings, Joy kept showing up. And throughout this, in these early days, Joy, it was a little bit tricky. Joy, but I remember when I became a part of this church, and just started coming in 2003, became a member in 2004, Joy by that point was what I would call quietly affirming. We loved gay people that came in the door. We would never be exclusionary to people who came here, but we weren't actively opening the door. We weren't doing any kind of thing that would let gay people know this is a gay-friendly church. We were quiet. We were in the closet about being affirming, unfortunately. And I remember Cheryl and I being kind of aggravated about that. I remember at some business meetings, Cheryl and I kind of expressing our disgruntlement. We felt like the church needed to be a little more open about it. But throughout it, we stayed in conversation, and we kept engaging, and we kept sharing our experiences. And so because of that, when Randall Spaulding lost his ministerial credentials by the Mennonite Church for a time, and by the way, the purple and green songbooks that have all the newer songs, a lot of them are really good songs, Randall, he was at the time the head of the committee that edited those songbooks. Mm-hmm. But because the Southeast Mennonite Conference took away his credentials, the Mennonite Church USA for a time took Randall off of the committee that edited the songbooks after he'd already done this amazing job of editing these songbooks. Really disturbing. By the way, this story, like everything, nothing ever ends like you think it will. Randall for a time left the Mennonite Church, was involved in the Unitarians, but now is the pastor of Boulder Mennonite Church. So he's... in that conflict, Joy spoke up. When Joanna Heriter in Kansas was in trouble with the conference for officiating at a same-sex wedding, Joy took a stand then as well. And so eventually, we did come out of the closet as a church, and that's why we have the certificate in the kitchen from the Supporting Communities Network that Joy is officially a part of. All of that change, all of that work came because of our relationship with Michael, because our hearts were open, because at that moment we extended the doors. It changed us forever. And that, to me, is a resurrection that's a continuing thing. In fact, just as one example, I found this picture a few years ago when we were at the Gay Pride Festival, just as an example of the engagement. Oh, there we go. Anyway, to close, I'm enough of an ex-evangelical that I know all good sermons end with an invitation or a challenge or some kind of exhortation. And so here's the challenge I want to give us as a community. Michael King's death transformed our congregation, and he should be remembered for that. I think a touching way for us to do that as a congregation would be to participate in one of the world's largest collaborative art projects, the AIDS Memorial Quilt. And here's a picture of it on display when it's out at the Washington Mall. So to do this, we would create a quilt panel in Michael's honor. And so first of all, it would be a matter of designing a quilt panel. And one thing I'd love to do is if you research more to try to find more about Michael's life. And there may not be a lot else available, but if we can, it'd be great to incorporate more elements of his life onto the panel. But this is a picture of them all displayed out. Here's a picture of They have a website you can log in, and just to give an example of just kind of the things that people put on these quilts. They can be done in many ways, by the way. They can be done in a more traditionally quilted method with cloth that's sewed onto cloth, but people also paint on them, they dye them, in basically any form of art that's on the cloth form and that can be rolled up and whatnot can be done. They do have some specific measurements you have to kind of, so it fits into the broader pattern, but other than that, there's a great deal of freedom in doing this. And my suggestion is if we do this, we would really engage with it throughout as a spiritual activity. So the process of designing it, of creating it together. But then after that, my suggestion is we would have a special service at some point, maybe sometime during the Pride season in June, of remembrance of Michael and others who were victims of AIDS. Of having that special service and giving also a space for people in this community who still may be mourning loved ones they couldn't mourn in the past, and give them a space to do so. And then after that, of course, we would then send the quilt panel to be part of the traveling project. And by the way, this tours all across the country. It's so big now, they tour in set. They don't always bring the whole quilt out. It's so big. But it's also, one of the beautiful things is also it is archived online. So the entire quilt, you could search by name and see everyone's quilt panel. So it would be a big project, but I think it'd be a really cool one. So anyway, thank you so much for giving me the chance to speak this morning, and thank you for being the kind of church that loves those that others want to throw away.